He did not enter history to win quickly. He entered it to prevent collapse, at a moment when survival itself was uncertain and endurance had not yet been learned. The continent did not feel on the verge of transformation. It felt heavy, stretched thin by distance and habit, uncertain of its own coherence. British North America in the mid-18th century was vast but uneven, a collection of colonies bound more by trade routes and imperial paperwork than by shared purpose. Roads dissolved into mud beyond settled centers. Messages traveled slowly, arriving altered by time and interpretation. Authority existed, but it was dispersed, negotiated, and often resisted quietly rather than openly challenged. Conflict simmered not as a unified rebellion, but as a series of local pressures. Grievances layered atop one another without a clear mechanism for resolution. The land itself imposed restraint. Forests closed in around settlements. Rivers dictated movement. Winter slowed everything, forcing patience where ambition might otherwise have surged. In this environment, sustained war was not yet imaginable as a collective undertaking. It was a distant abstraction, spoken of in pamphlets and speeches but rarely experienced as a continuous, organizing reality. When George Washington emerged into this unsettled landscape, he did not do so as a symbol of revolution. He was known but not mythologized. His reputation rested on experience earned at the margins of empire, where authority was provisional and danger routine. He had learned command not through decisive victories but through exposure to uncertainty. Frontier skirmishes, fragile supply lines, and the constant negotiation between obedience and autonomy among men unaccustomed to strict discipline. Service under British command had taught him procedure, hierarchy, and the limits of imperial attention. It had also taught him restraint, an understanding that force applied without preparation often produced consequences more damaging than delay. These lessons were not celebrated qualities. They did not inspire immediate confidence. Yet they shaped a temperament suited to endurance rather than spectacle. His appointment as commander was therefore cautious, almost reluctant. It represented compromise more than enthusiasm, an attempt to balance regional interests and social expectations rather than a declaration of unified intent. Those who supported him did so because alternatives seemed less viable, not because certainty had been achieved. Authority arrived with conditions attached, shaped by civilian oversight, regional suspicion, and the unspoken awareness that failure would be difficult to contain. Washington accepted this responsibility without illusion. He did not inherit a ready instrument of war. He inherited fragmentation, limited resources, and an expectation that order could be imposed where habit resisted it. The early reality of command confirmed these conditions. Militias assembled unevenly, bound more by local obligation than by collective identity. Weapons varied, training was inconsistent, and discipline was fragile. Men arrived with assumptions shaped by civilian life, resistant to prolonged subordination. Supplies arrived late or not at all. Clothing wore thin quickly. Food quality fluctuated with season and access. Disease moved more efficiently than information. In this context, leadership was not defined by movement on maps or clarity of objective. It was defined by the ability to maintain presence, to prevent dispersal, to ensure that the army existed from one day to the next. Washington's interior landscape reflected this strain. Ambition existed, but it was tempered by an acute awareness of vulnerability. He understood that the appearance of confidence mattered, even when certainty was absent. Silence became a tool. Decisions were measured, sometimes criticized as cautious, yet shaped by the recognition that irreversible action carried costs the system could not absorb. He learned quickly that morale was not sustained by promises of victory, but by predictability. Orders needed consistency. Punishment needed restraint. Reward needed to feel earned. The army watched him closely, gauging whether authority would fracture under pressure or hold its shape. Around him, political expectations pressed inward. Civilian leaders demanded results without fully grasping constraints. They feared disorder as much as defeat, wary that an uncontrolled army could become as dangerous as the enemy. Washington navigated this tension carefully, maintaining deference while protecting operational autonomy. He wrote constantly, explaining, justifying, documenting. Paperwork became as essential as drill. The war was already being fought on multiple levels, and coherence depended on alignment between them. No decisive action defined this opening phase. Instead, days accumulated, marked by movement without culmination. Marches ended in temporary encampments. Skirmishes tested resolve without resolving conflict. Each choice deferred larger confrontation while preserving capacity. This restraint frustrated some and reassured others. What mattered was not that the war advanced, but that it did not collapse inward. The army remained intact. Authority, though questioned, remained functional. These were modest achievements, yet they carried disproportionate weight. Washington did not yet embody inevitability. He embodied responsibility. He understood that victory, if it came, would be the product of survival extended over time rather than brilliance concentrated in moments. His task was not to inspire through vision, but to organize uncertainty into something that could persist. Collapse was always closer than triumph. Preventing it required attention to detail, patience under criticism, and acceptance that progress might remain invisible for long stretches. The opening phase of the conflict therefore established a pattern rather than a direction. It demonstrated that the struggle would be defined by endurance before outcome, by maintenance before momentum. Washington's leadership began here, not as an assertion of destiny, but as a response to fragility. The stakes were implicit, carried in the silence between engagements and the weight of decisions deferred. History did not yet point forward clearly. It pressed downward, demanding that something, anything, remain standing long enough for possibility to take shape. The early months of Washington's command stripped away any lingering assumptions that leadership alone could transform circumstance. The army he inherited was not simply inexperienced. It was structurally misaligned with the demands being placed upon it. Militias arrived with strong local identities and weak collective purpose, men accustomed to answering first to their communities rather than to distant authority. Discipline, where it existed, was negotiated rather than enforced. Orders were followed when they aligned with personal judgment and resisted when they did not. Washington observed this without surprise but with growing concern, recognizing that an army held together by consent alone could dissolve under sustained pressure. The problem was not courage. It was continuity. Daily life in camp reinforced these limits. Supplies arrived irregularly, often spoiled or incomplete. Uniforms varied so widely that distinguishing units at a distance proved difficult. Weapons differed in quality and familiarity, complicating training and maintenance. Even basic necessities, shoes, blankets, adequate food, were inconsistent. Their absence felt most sharply during long watches and cold nights. Men grew restless not from fear of battle, but from uncertainty about whether the institution they served could sustain them. Washington moved through these spaces deliberately, aware that presence mattered even when solutions were unavailable. He saw how quickly morale could erode when neglect appeared habitual rather than temporary. Authority above him proved no less fragmented. Civilian oversight existed in theory, but it functioned through committees with overlapping jurisdictions and competing priorities. Requests for resources passed through layers of deliberation before reaching decision, often returning altered or delayed. Political leaders feared standing armies almost as much as imperial control, wary that military power could escape civilian restraint. Washington understood these anxieties, having absorbed them as part of his upbringing, yet he also recognized their cost. Command without reliable backing reduced leadership to persuasion rather than direction. He adjusted accordingly, framing demands carefully, emphasizing necessity over ambition, documenting every shortage and delay to preserve accountability. This environment forced Washington to redefine command in practice. He could not rely on punishment alone to enforce compliance. Excessive severity risked desertion or open resistance. Yet leniency carried its own dangers, signaling weakness where cohesion was already thin. He chose moderation, applying discipline unevenly but consistently enough to establish expectation. Small acts, regular inspections, standardized drills, predictable routines, began to impose rhythm where none had existed. Progress was incremental and often invisible to those expecting dramatic change. Still, structure accumulated slowly, shaping behavior through repetition rather than decree. Psychologically, this period tested Washington's restraint more than his resolve. He felt the weight of scrutiny from all sides. Soldiers judging fairness, officers gauging competence, politicians measuring loyalty. Confidence had to be projected without arrogance. Uncertainty concealed without dishonesty. Letters written late into the night reveal a man acutely aware of limits, calculating not only what could be done, but what must be avoided. Overextension, he knew, could destroy credibility faster than inaction. The absence of clear victory sharpened this awareness, forcing him to find value in survival itself. Containment became the guiding principle. Washington aimed not to defeat the enemy outright, but to prevent disintegration. Every decision was filtered through this lens. Engagements were weighed against potential loss of manpower that could not be replaced easily. Retreats, when necessary, were conducted with order rather than panic, preserving the appearance of control. This approach frustrated critics who equated leadership with aggression. Yet it aligned with the reality that the Army's greatest threat lay within its own fragility. Holding ground mattered less than holding people together. Trust emerged slowly as a result of this consistency. Soldiers began to recognize patterns in command, understanding what was expected and what could be relied upon. Officers learned that directives, though sometimes cautious, were rarely arbitrary. Political leaders, though impatient, observed that the Army remained functional despite circumstances that might have destroyed less disciplined forces. Authority, initially conditional, gained substance through endurance. It was not imposed. It accumulated. Environmental factors reinforced these lessons. Weather dictated movement, turning roads into barriers and camps into tests of endurance. Silence during long watches amplified anxiety, broken only by routine signals that reassured men that structure persisted. Physical strain became a shared experience, binding individuals through hardship rather than ideology. Washington did not romanticize this suffering. He sought to mitigate it where possible, aware that excessive hardship bred resentment rather than loyalty. Still, he accepted that some strain was unavoidable, a reality that demanded management rather than denial. By the end of this phase, little had changed outwardly. The enemy remained formidable. Resources were still scarce. Political unity was incomplete. Yet internally, something had shifted. The Army had not collapsed. Its systems, though imperfect, functioned with greater regularity. Leadership was no longer theoretical. It was practiced daily, in decisions that prioritized cohesion over acclaim. Washington's authority remained conditional, but the conditions were narrowing. Trust, once tentative, began to feel earned through presence and restraint rather than promise. This chapter of the war established a fundamental truth that would shape everything that followed. Endurance was not a byproduct of victory but a prerequisite for it. Washington did not yet command inevitability. He cultivated possibility by holding together institutions designed more for independence than obedience. In doing so, he learned the boundaries of power and the necessity of patience, lessons that would govern his conduct as pressures intensified. The war advanced not through decisive action, but through the quiet refusal to disintegrate under strain. As the war widened, its demands outpaced early expectations with unsettling speed. Engagements that had once seemed manageable revealed deeper asymmetries in training, supply, and experience. British forces moved with professional confidence, supported by established logistics and naval reach, while the Continental Army strained to maintain coherence under pressure. Defeats arrived not as isolated shocks but as a sequence, each compounding the last. Positions were abandoned, cities fell under occupation, and rumors traveled faster than orders. At home, confidence thinned. Abroad, potential allies measured the rebellion's prospects with caution. The cost of failure was no longer theoretical. It pressed inward from every direction. Washington absorbed these reversals with a restraint that masked their cumulative weight. Loss did not provoke rash counterstroke or public despair. Instead, it sharpened his sense of proportion. He understood that the enemy's advantage lay not merely in strength but in the expectation that pressure would force collapse. To resist that expectation, he recalibrated purpose. Victory, once imagined as decisive confrontation, receded into the background. Survival moved forward. This was not resignation. It was adaptation. Retreat, when chosen deliberately, preserved manpower and command structure. Each withdrawal traded ground for time, a resource the rebellion needed more than territory it could not yet defend. The physical experience of retreat shaped the army's character. Long marches under uncertain orders tested endurance more severely than battle. Boots wore thin. Hunger became familiar. Silence stretched between columns as men conserved energy and thought about home. Discipline was no longer abstract. It was the difference between cohesion and flight. Washington remained visible during these movements, riding along lines, acknowledging strain without dramatizing it. As the war widened, its demands outpaced early expectations with unsettling speed. Engagements that had once seemed manageable revealed deeper asymmetries in training, supply, and experience. British forces moved with professional confidence, supported by established logistics and naval reach, while the Continental Army strained to maintain coherence under pressure. Defeats arrived not as isolated shocks but as a sequence, each compounding the last. Positions were abandoned, cities fell under occupation, and rumors traveled faster than orders. At home, confidence thinned. Abroad, potential allies measured the rebellion's prospects with caution. The cost of failure was no longer theoretical. It pressed inward from every direction. Washington absorbed these reversals with a restraint that masked their cumulative weight. Loss did not provoke rash counterstroke or public despair. Instead, it sharpened his sense of proportion. He understood that the enemy's advantage lay not merely in strength but in the expectation that pressure would force collapse. To resist that expectation, he recalibrated purpose. Victory, once imagined as decisive confrontation, receded into the background. Survival moved forward. This was not resignation. It was adaptation. Retreat, when chosen deliberately, preserved manpower and command structure. Each withdrawal traded ground for time, a resource the rebellion needed more than territory it could not yet defend. The physical experience of retreat shaped the army's character. Long marches under uncertain orders tested endurance more severely than battle. Boots wore thin. Hunger became familiar. Silence stretched between columns as men conserved energy and thought about home. Discipline was no longer abstract. It was the difference between cohesion and flight. Washington remained visible during these movements, riding along lines, acknowledging strain without dramatizing it. His presence reinforced the idea that retreat was not abandonment but repositioning, a temporary narrowing rather than an ending. Psychologically, this phase demanded constant management of fear and expectation. Soldiers accustomed to measuring success by advance had to accept withdrawal as necessary. Washington framed this acceptance through example rather than explanation. He avoided language of defeat, emphasizing instead the intactness of the army. As long as it remained, resistance remained possible. This logic gradually took hold. Men learned that survival itself carried strategic weight, that each preserved regiment represented continued defiance. Endurance became an ethic, not born of ideology but of lived necessity. Externally, the accumulation of losses complicated diplomacy. Foreign observers assessed not rhetoric but results. They watched whether the army disintegrated under pressure or adapted. Washington's approach offered them evidence of the latter. Though battles were lost, command coherence held. Communications continued. Civil authority remained linked to military leadership. This continuity mattered. It suggested that the rebellion possessed internal discipline even when momentum faltered. Preservation, quietly executed, signaled seriousness of purpose. Within the army, this period clarified Washington's leadership style. He did not chase redemption through reckless engagement. He chose battles carefully, often declining opportunities that promised glory at disproportionate risk. Critics accused him of caution, misunderstanding its function. He measured success not by immediate gain but by the army's condition afterward. Losses could be absorbed, annihilation could not. This calculus guided decisions that, taken individually, seemed modest but collectively ensured survival through sustained adversity. Environmental factors amplified these choices. Winter imposed constraints that favored defense and patience. Camps became laboratories of endurance, where survival depended on organization more than bravery. Supply shortages forced improvisation. Officers learned to manage scarcity without surrendering authority. Washington oversaw these adaptations with close attention, aware that suffering unacknowledged could corrode loyalty. Efforts to secure provisions, even when incomplete, demonstrated commitment to the Army's welfare. This mattered as much as tactical success. The enemy, expecting collapse, encountered instead persistence. British command found itself drawn into a prolonged conflict that strained its own resources and political will. Each failure to end the rebellion quickly altered strategic assumptions. Washington's refusal to offer decisive engagement denied the enemy a clear victory narrative. The war elongated, its costs mounting for both sides. In this extension lay opportunity. Time allowed the Continental Army to mature, to standardize training, to integrate experience into practice. Endurance created space for growth. Internally, ambition transformed. Early visions of swift triumph gave way to a sober understanding of process. Officers adjusted expectations, focusing on maintaining units rather than achieving personal distinction. Washington encouraged this shift implicitly, rewarding reliability over daring. Promotion and responsibility followed steadiness. The Army's culture evolved accordingly. Success became collective rather than individual, measured by continued function under pressure. This evolution was not without strain. Morale fluctuated. Desertion remained a threat. Political criticism persisted. Washington navigated these challenges by maintaining consistency in purpose. His communications emphasized continuity, reminding both soldiers and civilians that the war's outcome depended on sustained effort rather than singular events. This message, repeated without flourish, began to define the rebellion's identity. It framed the conflict as a test of endurance rather than a contest of brilliance. By the close of this phase, endurance had supplanted ambition as the Army's central ethic. This was not defeatism. It was realism shaped by circumstance. The Army had learned to live within its limits, preserving strength for moments when opportunity aligned with capacity. Losses had not disappeared, but they no longer dictated direction. Each setback was absorbed into a broader strategy that valued survival as progress. Washington emerged from this escalation altered but not diminished. His leadership was now associated less with battlefield command than with the management of adversity. He had demonstrated that refusal to collapse could be as consequential as victory. The Army, still imperfect, remained intact. In that fact lay the rebellion's continued possibility. Endurance, once a necessity, had become a deliberate practice, shaping decisions and expectations as the war moved forward under pressures that showed no sign of easing. Pressure from within arrived without warning and without the clarity that accompanied external threat. It did not march in formation or announce itself through cannon fire. It accumulated in correspondence, in delayed payments, in conversations held just out of earshot. Congress, burdened by scarcity and divided priorities, began to question whether endurance alone could justify continued confidence. Reports of defeat sharpened scrutiny. Committees demanded explanations that circumstances could not easily provide. Authority, once granted by necessity, now required continual reaffirmation in an environment where outcomes lagged behind effort. Washington encountered this pressure as a test different in character from battlefield adversity. Military failure could be measured, adapted to, and absorbed through strategy. Political doubt was less tangible, more corrosive. It threatened not the Army's immediate survival, but its legitimacy. Criticism circulated unevenly, amplified by distance and delay. Decisions made under constraint were re-examined without context. Washington's responses were deliberate and restrained. He resisted public defensiveness, understanding that visible agitation would magnify uncertainty. Silence, carefully chosen, became a form of control. Within the officer corps, strain surfaced more directly. Ambition, previously tempered by shared crisis, reasserted itself as individuals sought explanation and advancement. Some questioned strategy openly. Others maneuvered quietly, appealing to Congress or regional leaders. The challenge was not mutiny, but fragmentation. Competing visions of authority threatened coherence. Washington recognized this risk and addressed it through consistency rather than confrontation. Orders remained measured. Favor was distributed predictably. Personal slights were absorbed without reprisal. By refusing to personalize dissent, he prevented it from consolidating into opposition. Regional loyalties further complicated unity. The army was not a homogeneous body but a convergence of local identities, each with its own expectations and grievances. Soldiers identified first with their colonies, then with the cause, and only gradually with the institution of the army itself. Supply shortages sharpened these distinctions. Units compared treatment, compensation, and recognition. Washington acknowledged disparities without promising immediate remedy. He understood that overcommitment would erode credibility. Instead, he emphasized shared hardship, framing inequality as consequence of circumstance rather than preference. The psychological discipline required to navigate this environment was considerable. Washington operated under constant observation, aware that every decision was interpreted through layers of expectation and doubt. He maintained routine as anchor. Correspondence followed established tone. Councils of war adhered to process. Appearances were steady, neither defiant nor conciliatory. This predictability reassured those who depended on him, even as it frustrated critics seeking decisive reassurance. Stability, rather than persuasion, became his primary instrument. Silence again played a central role. Washington did not rush to defend himself against every accusation. He chose moments of response carefully, providing context without protest. This restraint signaled confidence in process over personality. It suggested that authority did not require constant validation. Over time, this posture shaped perception. Critics found fewer openings to exploit. Supporters took cues from his composure. The absence of visible agitation reduced the emotional temperature within the army, allowing disputes to remain procedural rather than personal. The material conditions of command reinforced this discipline. Washington lived among scarcity, sharing in the discomforts of camp life. His physical presence under hardship carried psychological weight. Soldiers observed that leadership did not exempt him from strain. This visibility did not inspire fervor, but it reinforced fairness. Authority grounded in shared experience proved more durable than authority asserted through rank alone. Trust accumulated slowly, built from repeated demonstration rather than rhetoric. Internally, Washington managed fear by narrowing focus. He concentrated on what could be controlled, maintaining order, preserving morale, enforcing discipline where possible. He did not attempt to resolve every grievance, recognizing that overreach could destabilize existing balance. Instead, he prioritized continuity. As long as the army functioned, debate could be endured. Collapse, however, would render all arguments irrelevant. This hierarchy of concern guided decisions that appeared conservative but proved stabilizing. Congressional pressure required a different approach. Washington engaged respectfully, providing detailed reports that emphasized constraints alongside actions taken. He did not disguise difficulty, nor did he exaggerate success. This transparency carried risk, but it established credibility. Legislators, though frustrated, recognized the consistency of his communication. Over time, this reliability tempered criticism. Doubt did not disappear, but it became bounded, less likely to provoke abrupt change in leadership. The emotional toll of this period was cumulative. Washington carried awareness that his position was conditional, subject to forces beyond his control. Yet he did not allow this awareness to manifest as insecurity. He maintained professional distance, limiting personal exposure to rumor and speculation. This self-regulation was critical. Leaders who internalize every criticism risk erratic behavior. Washington's restraint preserved decision-making clarity, allowing him to separate personal reputation from institutional survival. Within the army, predictability became a stabilizing force. Soldiers and officers learned what to expect from command. Orders were clear. Punishments, when necessary, followed established norms. Rewards were modest but consistent. This regularity reduced anxiety. In an environment of uncertainty, routine offered reassurance. The army remained intact not because dissent vanished, but because it lacked fertile ground to grow. This phase clarified a central truth of Washington's leadership. Power was maintained not through dominance, but through reliability. He did not overwhelm opposition. He outlasted it. By remaining steady under scrutiny, he denied critics the spectacle of instability. By absorbing pressure without visible fracture, he preserved the army's coherence. Authority became associated with calm persistence rather than charisma. As internal pressure intensified, the army's survival depended increasingly on this psychological discipline. External threats continued, but internal cohesion proved equally decisive. Washington's ability to remain predictable under stress allowed the institution to function despite unresolved tensions. The army did not require unanimous confidence. It required sufficient trust to continue operating. That threshold was maintained through consistency. By the end of this period, Washington's leadership had been tested not by battle alone, but by sustained doubt. He emerged with authority altered but intact, defined less by acclaim than by endurance. The army remained a functioning entity, capable of action despite internal strain. This outcome was not dramatic. It was procedural, incremental, and fragile. Yet it marked a critical consolidation. The rebellion's survival now rested not only on resisting the enemy, but on managing itself. In that balance, Washington's steadiness proved decisive, setting conditions for the conflict's next phase through discipline quietly maintained under relentless internal pressure. The turning point arrived without ceremony, settling in gradually as cold and scarcity rather than as sudden reversal. Winter pressed itself into every surface of the encampment, hardening ground, stiffening fabric, and slowing movement until effort itself became visible. Fires burned low to conserve fuel. Breath hung in the air longer than speech. The army did not face annihilation by decisive engagement, but by attrition measured in frostbite, sickness, and quiet resignation. Survival demanded attention not to maneuver, but to continuity. Washington understood that this phase would not be defined by tactical brilliance. The enemy did not need to destroy the army outright. Time and exposure could accomplish the same result. The real threat lay in disintegration, in men drifting away, discipline eroding, institutions dissolving under strain. Leadership therefore shifted away from battlefield command toward structural endurance. Washington's role became one of organization rather than inspiration, shaping systems capable of absorbing suffering without collapse. The camps revealed the limits of improvisation. Supplies arrived irregularly, if at all. Clothing wore thin. Food rations fluctuated between scarcity and absence. These conditions exposed weaknesses in administrative networks more starkly than any defeat. Washington responded not with rhetoric, but with procedure. Records were tightened. Supply requests became more precise. Responsibility was assigned clearly, even when resources were lacking. By clarifying process, he reduced confusion, allowing hardship to be endured rather than multiplied by disorder. Silence again became a defining feature. Complaints were constant, but Washington did not allow them to dominate command atmosphere. He acknowledged deprivation without dramatizing it. Orders continued to be issued with the same cadence, neither softened nor intensified by circumstance. This consistency communicated an implicit expectation. Suffering was to be managed, not lamented. Over time, this expectation reshaped behavior. Soldiers adjusted routines. Officers focused on maintenance rather than initiative. The army adapted to a slower, more constrained rhythm. Physical strain altered psychology. Fatigue narrowed perspective, making immediate discomfort feel permanent. Washington countered this tendency by emphasizing duration rather than outcome. He spoke less of victory and more of survival through the season. By reframing objectives in temporal terms, he aligned expectations with reality. Endurance ceased to be a stopgap and became an operational goal. The army existed not to achieve immediate success, but to remain in being. This shift marked a critical evolution. Earlier phases of the conflict relied on reactive resilience, responding to setbacks as they occurred. Winter demanded proactive endurance. Washington organized suffering into patterns that could be sustained. Duty rotations were enforced to prevent exhaustion. Medical care, though rudimentary, was systematized. Discipline tightened not as punishment, but as preservation. Order reduced energy expenditure. Structure conserved strength. The environment imposed humility. Commanders could not override weather or geography. Roads disappeared beneath snow. Communication slowed. Isolation increased. Washington adapted by decentralizing certain decisions while maintaining overall coherence. He trusted subordinates to manage local conditions within established parameters. This balance between control and autonomy prevented paralysis. Authority became distributed without becoming diluted. The psychological effect of this period was profound. The army learned that survival did not depend on dramatic action. It depended on routine, restraint, and collective patience. Men who endured this winter developed a different relationship to the cause. Commitment became less ideological and more experiential. Shared hardship forged bonds not through enthusiasm, but through mutual dependence. The institution gained depth, shaped by adversity rather than aspiration. Washington's personal conduct reinforced this transformation. He did not withdraw from hardship. His presence in camp, visible and consistent, signaled shared exposure. He observed conditions firsthand, adjusting policies based on observation rather than assumption. This proximity strengthened legitimacy. Orders issued by someone who endured the same cold carried greater weight, even when they demanded further sacrifice. Externally, observers misread this phase as stagnation. Lack of movement suggested weakness. Washington accepted this perception as cost of survival. He recognized that appearances mattered less than continuity. The army's existence itself became a strategic asset. As long as it remained intact, the conflict remained unresolved. This understanding guided decisions that prioritized preservation over engagement. The winter also clarified the limits of individual endurance. Men broke down physically and mentally. Desertion occurred. Washington responded without panic. Discipline was enforced selectively, emphasizing prevention over punishment. He recognized that excessive severity would accelerate collapse. Balance was maintained through moderation, preserving morale while sustaining order. This restraint reflected confidence in long-term cohesion rather than fear of immediate loss. Institutional learning accelerated under pressure. Mistakes became instructional rather than fatal. Supply failures prompted adjustments. Medical inadequacies spurred reorganization. Each hardship produced incremental improvement. Endurance, once reactive, became cumulative. The army emerged from winter altered, less vulnerable to the same stresses. This adaptability distinguished survival from mere persistence. By the season's end, the conflict had shifted subtly. The army had not grown stronger in conventional terms. Numbers remained limited. Resources were scarce. Yet something foundational had changed. The institution had learned how to last. It possessed routines capable of sustaining effort beyond initial enthusiasm. Leadership had moved from improvisation to maintenance, from reaction to anticipation. Washington's role in this transformation was structural rather than symbolic. He did not embody triumph. He embodied continuity. His leadership organized time, shaping endurance into a deliberate strategy. The revolution survived not because it overcame winter, but because it adapted to it. Survival ceased to be accidental and became systemic. As conditions eased and movement resumed, the army carried forward lessons etched by cold and scarcity. Endurance had been normalized. Suffering had been integrated into operational logic. The conflict could now proceed on different terms. What had begun as fragile resistance now possessed institutional depth. The revolution did not emerge renewed by victory, but stabilized by survival. History's momentum shifted quietly, not through decisive force, but through the disciplined ability to last. Foreign alliances entered the conflict without fanfare, not as rescue but as complication. Their arrival expanded the war's dimensions while exposing new vulnerabilities, binding American survival to external calculations that did not always align with immediate need. Washington understood that foreign aid could amplify strength, but it could also distort priorities. Dependency carried its own risks, especially for a cause still struggling to define its internal coherence. Assistance had to be integrated carefully, reinforcing endurance rather than replacing it. Diplomacy operated on a different rhythm than campaigning. Negotiations moved slowly, shaped by distant courts, shifting interests, and cautious assessments of credibility. Washington followed these developments with measured attention, aware that expectations at home could easily outrun reality abroad. Foreign powers did not invest in aspirations. They invested in persistence. The Army's continued existence, despite hardship, became its most persuasive argument. Endurance served not only military survival but diplomatic legitimacy. Coordination introduced friction. Language barriers, cultural assumptions, and differing command traditions complicated cooperation. Washington approached these challenges with restraint, avoiding gestures that might undermine authority or provoke resentment. He framed alliances as partnerships rather than solutions, maintaining clarity about American command structures. This balance preserved autonomy while enabling collaboration, preventing foreign involvement from dissolving fragile institutional boundaries. Material support altered logistics but did not eliminate scarcity. Supplies improved unevenly, creating disparities that had to be managed carefully to prevent morale fractures. Washington emphasized distribution discipline, ensuring aid strengthened collective capacity rather than individual privilege. External resources were folded into existing systems, reinforcing habits formed during deprivation rather than eroding them. The Army's identity remained shaped by endurance, not abundance. Strategically, alliances extended the war's horizon. Victory no longer hinged on isolated engagements but on sustained coordination across theaters and seasons. Washington adjusted expectations accordingly, emphasizing patience and timing. Opportunities were evaluated through a cumulative lens, where incremental advantage mattered more than dramatic success. This approach reduced risk, aligning military action with diplomatic momentum rather than impulsive ambition. Psychologically, foreign recognition validated sacrifice without resolving uncertainty. Soldiers understood that assistance signaled legitimacy, yet daily conditions remained harsh. Washington managed this tension by maintaining consistency in leadership tone. He neither inflated expectations nor diminished achievement. Progress was framed as gradual alignment rather than imminent triumph, preserving morale without inviting disillusionment. Foreign officers brought experience and perspective, sometimes clashing with local realities. Washington listened selectively, integrating useful insights while rejecting proposals misaligned with circumstances. Authority was exercised through judgment rather than assertion. By filtering external advice through contextual understanding, he ensured alliances enhanced capacity without undermining coherence. The presence of allies also complicated accountability. Failures could be blamed outward, successes attributed inward. Washington resisted both impulses. Responsibility remained centralized, preventing diffusion of leadership. This discipline reinforced institutional integrity, ensuring the Army's evolution remained internally driven despite external reinforcement. As coordination improved, the conflict's character shifted subtly. Operations reflected patience and synchronization rather than urgency. Timing became as important as force, with movements calibrated to diplomatic developments and logistical readiness. Washington's leadership emphasized restraint, recognizing that premature action could squander cumulative advantage. Endurance now operated on an international scale, linking battlefield persistence to geopolitical alignment. Foreign involvement did not resolve vulnerability. It reframed it. Dependence introduced new risks but also new buffers. Washington navigated this complexity by maintaining clarity of purpose. The revolution's survival still rested on internal discipline and cohesion. External support amplified these qualities but could not substitute for them. Over time, alliances normalized. What began as tentative cooperation matured into structured partnership. This evolution mirrored the Army's own development, moving from improvisation toward systematization. Victory emerged not as a singular event but as an accumulation of aligned efforts, sustained across time and geography. Washington's role remained consistent. He did not become a figure of dominance but of calibration, adjusting relationships and expectations to preserve balance. His leadership absorbed foreign influence without surrendering direction. Endurance, once forged in isolation, now operated within a broader network, retaining its character while expanding its reach. The conflict advanced without resolution, yet with increased stability. Alliances strengthened the revolution's position without simplifying its challenges. Survival continued to depend on discipline, patience, and restraint. What changed was scale, not essence. The war moved forward through alignment rather than breakthrough, shaped by cumulative pressure rather than decisive collapse. As momentum began to shift, the change was perceptible less in proclamations than in posture. Camps settled with slightly more order, correspondents carried a quieter confidence, and the Army's movements reflected anticipation rather than desperation. Yet Washington resisted the temptation to interpret this shift as permission for transformation. He did not recast himself as a conqueror, nor did he allow the Army to imagine itself suddenly ascendant. The habits formed under pressure remained intact because he insisted they remain so. Opportunity was acknowledged, but it was not allowed to dictate behavior. Restraint, refined through years of necessity, continued to govern decision-making even when circumstances seemed to invite risk. This discipline was not passive. It required constant effort to maintain caution amid rising expectations. Victories, however limited, generated voices calling for decisive blows and dramatic advances. Political leaders sensed leverage, officers sought distinction, and soldiers longed for closure. Washington absorbed these pressures without yielding to them. His experience had taught him that premature confidence could undo years of endurance. Gains were meaningful only if they could be sustained, and sustainability depended on preserving the Army's cohesion rather than pursuing dramatic resolution. The physical environment reinforced this mindset. Roads remained poor, supplies inconsistent, and communication fragile. Terrain that had once hindered retreat now constrained advance. Washington evaluated each movement against these realities, measuring ambition against capacity. He chose positions that favored preservation over spectacle, even when critics interpreted caution as hesitation. His authority rested on an understanding that momentum was a condition to be managed, not exploited recklessly. Psychologically, this period demanded a different kind of leadership. Earlier, Washington had needed to hold together an army on the brink of dissolution. Now he had to prevent it from fragmenting under the weight of success. Confidence could be as corrosive as despair if left unchecked. He maintained consistency in tone, neither celebrating excessively nor minimizing progress. Orders emphasized readiness and discipline, reinforcing the idea that stability, not triumph, remained the objective. Legitimacy was at stake. The revolution's moral authority depended on its adherence to principles as much as its military viability. Washington understood that overextension could invite abuses, alienate civilian support, and fracture political unity. By limiting risk, he preserved the fragile trust that connected Army, Congress, and population. Authority strengthened because it remained bounded, exercised with awareness of consequence rather than impulse. Opportunities were filtered through institutional priorities. Engagements were chosen for strategic value rather than symbolic impact. Washington avoided scenarios that might deliver dramatic victory at disproportionate cost. Losses, even in moments of advantage, could unravel hard-won stability. He favored maneuvers that maintained pressure without committing irreversibly, allowing flexibility in response to changing conditions. This approach frustrated critics but sustained coherence. The Army's internal dynamics reflected this restraint. Promotions, discipline, and logistics continued to follow established processes. Washington resisted favoritism and resisted calls to reward success prematurely. Recognition was measured, reinforcing the idea that individual distinction mattered less than collective function. Soldiers sensed that expectations had not shifted dramatically, and this continuity stabilized morale. Externally, restraint shaped perception. Allies observed an army that did not rush toward overconfidence, reinforcing credibility. Opponents faced a force that absorbed momentum without exposing vulnerability. Washington's caution made prediction difficult, denying adversaries the clarity that often accompanies aggressive advance. This ambiguity functioned as strategic protection, preserving advantage through uncertainty. Leadership under these conditions required emotional regulation. Washington's correspondence reveals a careful balance between hope and realism. He acknowledged progress while reminding subordinates of ongoing limitations. His personal restraint modeled the behavior he expected, setting a tone that permeated command structures. Authority was reinforced through predictability, not charisma. The revolution's approach toward success did not erase hardship. Camps remained uncomfortable, supplies uneven, and disease persistent. These conditions tempered celebration and reinforced humility. Washington leveraged this reality, allowing environment to remind the Army that survival still required discipline. Momentum did not dissolve the need for vigilance. It intensified it. This phase redefined success. It was no longer measured by survival alone, but by the ability to advance without sacrificing cohesion. Washington's refusal to transform into a conquering figure preserved the revolution's character. Authority remained rooted in service rather than dominance, aligning leadership with the values that justified resistance in the first place. As progress continued, the absence of dramatic excess became itself a stabilizing force. The revolution moved forward without rupture, accumulating strength through consistency. Washington's restraint prevented internal fracture by denying opportunity the power to disrupt discipline. Legitimacy deepened because authority did not overreach. The war approached resolution not through decisive collapse, but through sustained alignment of effort, restraint, and timing. Washington's leadership ensured that momentum served continuity rather than spectacle. The revolution advanced toward success without abandoning the habits that had allowed it to endure, preserving coherence as circumstances shifted. Victory arrived quietly, almost reluctantly, announced less by celebration than by the slow disappearance of urgency. The war did not end in a single, overwhelming moment that redefined everything at once. Instead, it concluded through accumulation of strain, of cost, of diminishing options. For years, conflict had persisted because all sides believed endurance might still bend circumstances in their favor. When that belief finally eroded, resolution followed not as spectacle but as release. What remained was not triumph in the traditional sense, but confirmation that the system Washington had labored to preserve could now stand without constant emergency. The physical signs of this shift were subtle. Camps that had once been temporarily hardened into ordered spaces, then gradually emptied. Soldiers moved with less haste, their routines no longer shaped by imminent threat. Supply trains carried fewer munitions and more administrative materials, papers replacing powder as the instruments of transition. The environment itself seemed to exhale. Roads that had borne the weight of forced marches now carried men returning home, their pace governed by memory rather than command. Washington's role in this phase was defined by restraint as much as it had been during the war's darkest moments. He did not seek to dramatize the end, nor did he allow the army to imagine itself entitled to political authority by virtue of survival. His correspondence emphasized order, patience, and accountability. The habits that had sustained the army under pressure were now redirected toward dissolution rather than action. Disbandment, carefully managed, became the final test of leadership. Psychologically, this moment carried risks different from those of defeat. Soldiers who had endured years of deprivation faced uncertainty about recognition, compensation, and place within the society they had defended. Resentment was possible, even likely, if expectations were mishandled. Washington understood that the transition from war to peace could fracture cohesion as easily as battle. His approach was deliberate. He acknowledged sacrifice without inflaming grievance, reinforcing the idea that service had meaning precisely because it did not entitle forceful reward. The Army's dissolution unfolded gradually, structured to prevent implosion. Units were released in stages, pay disputes addressed through process rather than improvisation. Washington resisted calls to leverage the Army's strength for political concessions, recognizing that coercion at this stage would poison the legitimacy so carefully maintained. Power, he believed, had to recede as visibly as it had risen, demonstrating that authority derived from consent rather than threat. This transfer of power marked a profound departure from historical precedent. Armies that won wars often lingered as political actors, shaping outcomes through presence alone. Washington rejected this path not through declaration, but through action. He returned authority to civilian institutions without spectacle, reinforcing the separation between military necessity and governance. The absence of coercion was itself the message. Stability emerged not because alternatives were crushed, but because they were no longer needed. Administratively, the shift was equally significant. Wartime structures adapted rather than collapsed. Records were preserved, chains of accountability maintained, and decisions documented with an eye toward continuity. Governance did not begin anew. It resumed under altered conditions. This continuity mattered. It signaled that the revolution had been a process of preservation as much as change, protecting the possibility of order even as allegiance shifted. Washington's personal conduct reinforced this transition. He avoided cultivating personal loyalty that might outlast necessity, presenting himself instead as a steward whose role was ending. His public appearances emphasized closure rather than command, his language careful to subordinate military achievement to collective effort. By minimizing himself at the moment when prominence was easiest, he stabilized the system he would soon leave behind. The emotional weight of the war did not dissipate instantly. Losses lingered in memory, scars remained visible, and communities bore uneven burdens. Washington did not attempt to resolve these complexities through rhetoric. He accepted that peace would inherit the war's consequences rather than erase them. Governance, he believed, would be judged by how it managed this inheritance, not by how decisively it declared victory. Internationally, the end of conflict recalibrated relationships. Recognition replaced alliance, negotiation replaced coordination. Washington navigated this shift with the same caution that had guided his wartime diplomacy. Independence did not mean isolation, but it did require self-definition. The structures that had supported endurance now supported autonomy, their purpose transformed without being dismantled. What distinguished this conclusion was its lack of finality. There was no moment that felt like an ending in absolute terms. Instead, the war receded, leaving behind institutions capable of functioning without constant mobilization. Victory confirmed that endurance had worked, that survival, once an improvisation, had become a foundation. Washington's leadership culminated not in dominance, but in withdrawal. By stepping away from power, he validated the principles that had justified resistance. Authority returned to civilian hands without crisis, demonstrating that the revolution had not merely replaced rulers but redefined the relationship between force and governance. The conditions for governance emerged intact because they had been protected throughout the conflict. Discipline, legitimacy, and restraint had not been sacrificed for speed or spectacle. The army dissolved without implosion because it had never been allowed to define itself as permanent. Power transferred without coercion because it had never been concentrated for its own sake. Victory, then, was less an achievement than a verification. It confirmed that an approach centered on endurance rather than conquest could sustain both war and peace. The revolution ended as it had been conducted, through patience, structure, and deliberate restraint, leaving behind a system prepared not for perpetual conflict, but for the slower, more demanding work of governance. Peace altered the weight of Washington's decisions rather than relieving it. The war had imposed clarity through necessity, narrowing choices to survival and coherence. In its absence, freedom expanded responsibility. The authority he held was no longer justified by emergency but sustained by habit, expectation, and the lingering presence of force. How that authority was released would determine whether endurance remained a personal achievement or became a permanent condition of governance. The transition began quietly, without ceremony. Military routines dissolved into administrative tasks, and Washington's correspondence shifted in tone. Orders gave way to recommendations, commands to explanations. This change was not cosmetic. It reflected an understanding that power retained through inertia could become corrosive. The habits forged under pressure needed deliberate adjustment if they were not to harden into entitlement. Washington moved carefully, aware that his actions would be observed not only by contemporaries but by successors who would inherit the precedents he established. Relinquishing military power was not an abstract gesture. It required confronting unresolved grievances among officers and soldiers whose sacrifices had been real and whose futures were uncertain. Washington addressed them without theatrical humility. He acknowledged obligation without promising impossibility, reinforcing the principle that service to the Republic did not confer permanent authority over it. His presence calmed rather than inflamed, precisely because it remained restrained. He neither distanced himself from responsibility nor clung to it. The physical act of stepping away carried symbolic weight. Uniforms were set aside, routines abandoned, and the rhythms of command replaced by civilian regularity. Washington understood the importance of visibility in this transition. Authority had to be seen withdrawing, not fading ambiguously. By returning power openly to civilian institutions, he clarified its proper location. Governance was not a continuation of war by other means. It was a different condition requiring different discipline. Psychologically, this shift demanded restraint of ambition. Washington had endured years of scrutiny, criticism, and near failure. Success offered the temptation of permanence, the chance to define the future through personal authority. He resisted this temptation not by denying it, but by subordinating it to structure. Leadership, he believed, was validated not by duration but by replacement. The Republic would only endure if its offices could function without dependence on exceptional individuals. Institutionally, this moment forced adaptation. Systems designed for crisis management now faced the challenge of routine governance. Emergency powers receded, and deliberative processes expanded. Washington supported this transition without attempting to control its outcomes. His influence remained significant, but it was exercised through counsel rather than command. This distinction mattered. It reinforced the expectation that authority flowed from office and law, not from personal stature earned through war. The Republic's expectations of leadership began to take shape through these actions. Power was understood as temporary, accountable, and bounded. Washington's example established a norm of voluntary limitation that carried greater force than any written rule. Endurance, once embodied in his personal resolve, became embedded in institutional behavior. Stability was no longer dependent on his presence but on the acceptance of restraint as a governing principle. Public perception adjusted accordingly. Washington's withdrawal did not diminish his stature. It clarified it. By refusing to convert military success into political dominance, he defined legitimacy as compatibility with limits. This perception reinforced trust in emerging institutions, making compliance less dependent on charisma and more on confidence in process. The Republic's cohesion deepened not through spectacle, but through predictability. The consequences of this transition extended beyond immediate governance. Future leaders inherited a framework shaped by deliberate precedent rather than improvisation. The expectation that authority would be relinquished peacefully became a measure of legitimacy. Deviations from this norm would later provoke anxiety precisely because Washington had demonstrated an alternative. His restraint became a benchmark against which ambition was judged. Emotionally, the period carried a quiet gravity. There was no catharsis equal to wartime survival, only the slower satisfaction of continuity. Washington accepted this without resentment. He understood that the absence of drama was itself an achievement. The Republic's ability to function without crisis signaled that endurance had moved from reaction to habit. This transformation did not eliminate conflict or disagreement. Political divisions emerged quickly, revealing the limits of unity forged under pressure. Washington navigated these tensions with caution, intervening selectively and emphasizing process over outcome. His goal was not to resolve every dispute but to reinforce the mechanisms through which disputes could be managed without violence. In this, endurance became procedural rather than heroic. The final significance of Washington's post-war leadership lay in its ordinariness. By choosing to act within constraints rather than above them, he normalized restraint as a civic virtue. The Republic learned to expect leaders to leave, power to change hands, and authority to remain stable through transition. Endurance, once a fragile achievement sustained by individual discipline, became an institutional expectation. In stepping aside, Washington completed a transformation that had begun under fire. He demonstrated that survival was not an end but a foundation, enabling governance grounded in choice rather than necessity. The Republic inherited not a savior, but a system calibrated for continuity. In peace, as in war, Washington's most consequential act was not what he claimed, but what he released, ensuring that endurance belonged not to a man, but to the structure he helped bring into being. Assessment of Washington's legacy requires restraint, because the habits he left behind resist simplification. He did not solve the problem of unity, nor did he imagine that cohesion, once achieved, would remain intact by force of precedent alone. What he contributed was narrower and more durable, a way of surviving pressure without surrendering structure. His leadership taught the emerging nation to privilege continuity over triumph, patience over display, and order over acceleration. These priorities were not articulated as ideology. They were demonstrated repeatedly through choice, especially when alternative paths promised faster or more dramatic rewards. Washington's experience had trained him to expect erosion rather than collapse. He understood that institutions rarely fail because of a single blow. They weaken when strain accumulates faster than response, when authority reacts emotionally rather than structurally, and when ambition outruns capacity. His career unfolded as a series of encounters with these conditions. Each time, he responded by narrowing focus to what could be preserved. This habit shaped his influence more than any philosophical position. Survival became the standard against which decisions were judged, not because survival was sufficient, but because without it nothing else remained possible. The nation that followed inherited this orientation indirectly. It did not receive a doctrine of endurance, but a pattern of behavior embedded in expectations of leadership. Authority was understood to operate within limits, to be temporary, and to justify itself through stability rather than assertion. These assumptions were fragile, contested, and often strained, but they existed because they had been enacted at moments when alternative choices were available. Washington's restraint mattered because it was voluntary. It demonstrated that power could be relinquished without loss of legitimacy, a lesson far more difficult to absorb than any written safeguard. This legacy carried consequences that Washington neither controlled nor fully anticipated. Endurance, once established as a governing principle, could be interpreted conservatively or expansively. It could justify caution in the face of injustice or patience during necessary reform. The model he left behind did not guarantee wisdom. It guaranteed time. That distinction mattered. Time allowed conflict to be managed rather than detonated. It permitted adjustment instead of rupture. Whether that time was used well remained an open question, one Washington left deliberately unanswered. The absence of sentimentality in this legacy is significant. Washington did not imagine the Republic as immune to decline. His decisions suggest an acceptance that all political orders are temporary, sustained by effort rather than destiny. Endurance was not framed as permanence but as resistance to premature failure. Collapse was not denied as a possibility. It was postponed through discipline. This perspective lent his leadership a sobriety that resisted myth even as myth accumulated around him. Subsequent generations would test the limits of this inheritance. Some would invoke Washington to justify restraint, others to legitimize authority. The tension between these uses reflected the incompleteness of any precedent. Yet the underlying model persisted, leadership measured by its capacity to hold systems together under stress. When the nation fractured, debates often centered not on whether Washington's vision had failed, but on who had departed from it. This alone indicates the depth of its influence. Washington's legacy also reshaped expectations of ambition. Achievement was decoupled from domination. Success became associated with maintenance as much as expansion. This redefinition was subtle but consequential. It altered how political careers were evaluated and how crises were navigated. Leaders were judged not only by what they achieved, but by what they preserved. The capacity to endure opposition, uncertainty, and criticism without destabilizing institutions became a form of competence. History moves forward unevenly, and the structures Washington helped stabilize would be tested repeatedly. They would bend, fracture, and sometimes fail. Yet the delay he engineered mattered. By extending the lifespan of fragile institutions, he allowed them to accumulate habit, memory, and legitimacy. These qualities cannot be created under constant emergency. They require continuity. Washington's greatest contribution lay in creating the conditions under which continuity could emerge. The nation that inherited this legacy did not receive certainty. It received a method: survival before ambition, structure before expansion, patience before spectacle. These priorities did not eliminate conflict, but they shaped its management. They encouraged negotiation over rupture and adjustment over eradication. When collapse eventually threatened, the language used to resist it often echoed patterns established in Washington's time. His legacy, then, is best understood as procedural rather than heroic. It does not promise success. It offers a way to remain functional when success is delayed or denied. This is a modest achievement by design, yet its consequences were expansive. By refusing to define victory as finality, Washington ensured that history remained open rather than resolved. In this openness lies the enduring weight of his influence. The Republic persisted not because it was shielded from failure, but because it learned how to absorb strain without immediate disintegration. Washington's life illustrates that endurance is not an act of defiance, but of organization. It is not dramatic. It is cumulative. History did not stop with him. It continued because he delayed its unraveling long enough for something imperfect, adaptable, and resilient to take shape and continue.